get it to recognize the board, and as a result, I lost the lecture. So if I have to reboot, someone remind me to save the lecture, okay? That way I don't, and restart the recording. Actually, I didn't lose the lecture. I forgot to restart it after I rebooted. So, okay, I apologize, but I have no control over the fact that our projector looks like it's dying on us there. It looks like the bulb is starting to go out there. So we have that there. Okay, I'm going to kind of jump ahead here, and I want to talk about interrupts, and then I'm going to kind of follow that up with the watchdog timer discussion out there. So as we go through here, introduction, interrupt organization out there. A lot of this stuff here is, I've talked about before, but out there, you would have seen it in the microprocessor class. We did not get into it as deep as I'd like to here, so out there. All right, an interrupt is the occurrence of a condition that causes temporary suspension of a program while the condition is serviced by another subroutine. In other words, something happens and we have to take care of that there. So I always use the example of nurses, because nurses tend to have more of a job that tends to lend itself to the idea of interrupts. That a nurse's job, as I understand it, and I have an ex-wife that was a nurse, and I put her through nursing school, including reading all of her textbooks and explaining everything to her. She had this bad habit of going to class and not listening to what the professor said. Come on in. So, up there. And if she hears this recording, that's okay, because she knows she did it up there. But she would go to a class, and she wouldn't listen to the professor, and she'd come back and hand me the textbook and say, please explain chapter 7 to me. So I'd have to read chapter 7 and explain it to her. And I did that so much that when it came time for her to take the nursing exam at the end of her 2-year nursing program, that I could pass the nursing exam. That there, because we had these computerized practice tests. I installed the software on the computer, took the practice nursing test, passed it the first time. It took her 3 days before she could pass it. So I got very good at there. So I can talk about nurses as an example, since I know very well what nurses do out there. And I did work in a hospital at one time. I put myself through college working part-time at a hospital. But it wasn't a normal hospital. It was, what do they call that? Hospital of Gila? You got there. So I spent 3 years working at a nut house, is the improper, politically incorrect term. You're not supposed to call it a nut house. You're supposed to call it a psychiatric care facility. So that qualified me to go into teaching. Actually qualified me to go into academic management. Students are very easy to manage. It's the faculty that sometimes is difficult to manage especially in American universities But regardless, a nurse's job is to go around from room to room and check on patients, come back to the nurse's station, fill out the forms of what she saw on the rounds, and they have a preset routine. But things happen in hospitals with patients. Unfortunately, hospitals are filled with sick people. That's one of the reasons I avoid going to hospitals is they're filled with sick people. And I tend to feel in a way that sometimes they should keep people out of hospitals that are not that sick, because they tend to get sicker if they're in hospitals around sicker people, especially young babies out there. I've got kind of an opinion on that. But regardless, when you got a group of sick people you're taking care of, sometimes they get worse and they need immediate attention. The extreme interrupt that would happen to a nursing station is that a heart rate monitor would go off and say that the patient's heart stopped beating and the nurse would have to stop what they're doing and go attend to that patient. Hopefully figure out some way to get it restarted Less extreme cases would be the IV pump or intravenous fluid pump that they have going in the arm that pumps fluid and there runs out of plasma or whatever fluid they're pumping into. It's usually plasma with some drugs added to it But various things such as that there. So that there. So an interrupt is a condition that requires immediate attention, or maybe not immediate attention. It depends on the severity of the interrupt. And we can rate our interrupts based on how important they are. In other words, we can give them a priority. Some interrupts are far more important than others. The example is the patient whose heart has stopped beating or is having serious trouble breathing is probably more important than the patient that is wanting the nurse to run down to the canteen and get them a can of soda. That typically is probably pretty far down the list of things that the nurse is going to stop doing. Same thing with our microcontroller. If our microcontroller senses that we're out of a particular chemical in a process that we're making, and this chemical is critical, we need to stop the production line and notify the operator to refill it. If the interrupt, but that's probably not important as the employee that hits the emergency stop button on the machine to stop the press from breaking, squeezing and breaking their hand. That's there. Way back in the dark ages, before I went in the military, before I went to college, we're talking way back, and dinosaurs walked the earth type thing, if you believe in dinosaurs, that there is that I worked in a company that made brake shoes and clutch faces, that there. And we had large presses that would literally take your hand and squish it into something about the size of a small pancake right there. So obviously if somebody hits the emergency stop button, you want to stop that press and open it back up immediately because there's a problem, there's an emergency. So interrupts allow the system to respond asynchronously. They don't have to wait until their time in line. Again, going back to my nurse. My nurse has got 7 rooms. She starts at the first room, walks in, checks on the patient, checks their blood pressure, takes their temperature, writes on their heart rate, does all these various things, asks them how they're doing, measures their level of pain, maybe adjust their IV accordingly if they're in a lot of pain to give them more pain medicine or that there. And then they go to the next room, that there. So that's referred to as polling. Polling means that we go around from each room to another, checking to see how the patient's doing. An interrupt means that the nurse gets an immediate call, an alarm goes off, or a buzzer goes off, or a light goes off, or something happens, and the nurse stops what they're doing and goes into that patient's room to attend to them immediately. That's what's meant by asynchronously. So we stop what we're doing and we go on to that. Same thing might happen if you're flying on an aircraft, although I would say flight attendants are probably less attentive to interrupts than nurses are. I don't know how many people have flown much, but if you hit the attendant call or the flight attendant call button on next to your seat, sometimes you wait 10 minutes for that person to come. That there, and sometimes you can't wait 10 minutes. You've got a baby that just threw up all over the floor, and you need that flight attendant to come down. And if they wait 10 minutes, it's a problem. But flight attendants, I notice, tend to be much less responsive. But again, the main reason is that 90% of flight attendants interrupts or calls are, I want to refill on my drink, or I want something, something to eat or whatever. They're usually not important, but sometimes they are important. So I tend to fault flight attendants for not responding quicker to the call button, because sometimes they are semi-emergencies to the person. The person sitting there with baby puke all over their lap, to them it's an emergency. That they're maybe not to the captain who's trying to fly the plane, but to the person sitting there with baby puke all over their lap, it is an emergency. But that's why I use nurses instead of flight attendants. So, okay. The interrupt system gives the illusion that it's doing many things at the same time. Well, it's really not. A processor, as you saw in the microprocessor course, can only execute one instruction at a time. So it's an illusion that it's monitoring all these things at the same time. So we have to write what's called the interrupt service routine or the interrupt handler. That's a program that we write there to handle the interrupt. Again, we talked a little bit about that last semester. There. So the interrupt service routine executes a response when it occurs. The main program temporarily suspends suspension and branches the interrupt. There. So upon the end of an interrupt, we have a return from interrupt. There. The return from interrupt instruction is different from the normal return instruction. There. Normally, when we do a call, there, we call a function right there. There. We haven't done much in terms of calls, but in C, we basically we call functions all the time. There, and the compiler at the end of a function call, will put a return. In assembly language, we would do the same thing. In other words, we have a call, we give it the label name, and at the end of the subroutine, we have a return. The same thing happens if we write in C. The compiler will replace our function call with a call and then the address of the instruction. That's what's going to be in the assembly language instructions if we took it apart and look at it. If we write an interrupt service routine, we have to place a return from interrupt at the end. Now, if you label in C a function as an interrupt service routine, then the compiler will take care of that automatically for us. So, okay, this is the program flow. It's the same chart that I went through last time there with you. But again, this is a timer overflow right there. This is very similar. We've got right here, this is where the interrupt occurs. It's executing our main program. This is our nurse going from patient room to patient room, right there. It gets a call. So when it gets the call, it's got to do several things. The first thing it's got to do, it's got to push the program counter onto the stack. Now, in the case of a nurse, let's assume that she's not, and I'm going to use she here. In the U.S., I have to use she, it, or she, him, because there are a lot of male nurses in the U.S. I have not run across too many male nurses in Malaysia. They do have male nurses in the U.S. Especially at psychiatric care facilities. Because they tend to want bigger people to work there because they have to subdue these patients from time to time. So, I dropped it out of my resume that I know how to put a straitjacket on, but I do know how to put a straitjacket on somebody. If you know what a straitjacket is, that's one of those little jackets that keep your hands pinned up there. That is a skill that I did learn at one time. I was quite proficient at. So, but regardless, well, let's say this nurse is not going from patient's room to patient's room, but she's sitting at the nurse's station reading a book. She's finished with her hourly round. She's gone around all 7 rooms. All the patients, vital signs have been taken. All of her charting has been done and everything. And now she's just sitting there reading a book, waiting for something to happen. So, and my ex-wife used to work nights, so I'd stop by and I'd have the fun task of going and getting dinner and dropping it off at the hospital. So I've walked in on many evenings and sat there and watched 6 nurses sitting around reading various books of various types. So they're sitting around reading books and we're chit-chatting. Well, the first thing that they're going to do when that nurse call light comes on or that heart rate monitor alarm goes off is that they're going to grab a bookmark and stick it in their book. The reason they stick the bookmark in the book is because they want to know where to go back to. That's the same thing here. We want to know where we want to return back to. When we're done, we want to come back and start executing our code at the next instruction. So we push onto the stack our program counter. The other thing we push onto the stack is all the registers. Now in our case, we've only got a few registers. We've got A and B, and then along with the flags and a couple of others in there. But we push them onto the stack. The reason we push those onto the stack is that we don't know what we were working on when the interrupt was called. So we have to be able to restore the processor back to its previous state. So that includes all the flags, all the the A register, the B register, R0 through R7, those are our registers that we're working on. Those are our temporary memory locations. So all those are pushed onto the stack that there. That would be the same thing as me just taking a bunch of papers and just folding them and setting them aside so I can pick back up where I was working when I finish servicing the interrupt. Then we just go through and we service our interrupt. We go to the patient's room and we find out what's wrong. If it's something serious, we call in the team to come in and do the CPR and try to restart the patient's heart. They get the paddles out and jump start the heart like you're jump starting your car. When it won't start. I don't know if you've probably seen that on TV, right? The paddles. Yeah, I've had the pleasure of seeing it in real life, and the patients literally do jump when they get hit with the shocks. And you don't want to be touching them because you'll get knocked across the floor. I have never done that, but I've seen people forget and lay their hand there, and next thing you know is they've got a sore shoulder where they jerk back at their, because they're getting with a lot of voltage, and electrical, your muscle nerves, nerves that control your muscles are electrically controlled. So if you get a shock in your arm, it will jerk back. My first experience was replacing an old CRT TV antenna. Unplugged it, but I didn't discharge the high voltage storage capacitor. And I reached back there to unplug that. And since I didn't discharge it, I got knocked across the floor. So I've had that experience of getting knocked across the floor with 10, 15,000 volts So, but you want to be able to restore back to where you're at right there. So, okay, so we execute our interrupt service routine right there. We do whatever it takes in order to service the routine. Now, we're assuming that this is a service routine that we can recover from and we can go back and execute our code. It may be an interrupt that we have to shut the system down. If this is an interrupt that we're getting too much petrol flowing out of our petrol pump because there's a leak, then our interrupt service routine would shut the pump down right there and send an error message into the desk or wherever. But it would deal with that there. But we'll assume that this is a standard interrupt where we want to just simply service it right there. And a lot of interrupts are very, very trivial. The most common is a timer interrupt. We want to take an analog measurement every so often. We set up a timer to overflow. It generates an interrupt. We go out, we take our measurement, and then we keep doing what we're doing right there. So once we're done, we restore everything back the way it was. We pop the registers from the stack, and we pop then the program counter. Now, the stack is a unique storage facility in the microprocessor right there. And let me talk a few minutes about the stack. The stack is a location in memory right there. It's in the data memory. So if you're going to be calling subroutines and having interrupts, you have to set aside space in the data memory for use for the stack. Now remember, our data memory is very small. It's 256 bytes minus 128 bytes for the special function registers, minus 32 bytes for the register set, or banks of the registers. So our stack can't be very big on an 8051. Our stack has to be relatively small. So, and every time we do a program, a subroutine call, we have to push this program counter onto the stack, plus any variables that we pass. So our stack has to be big enough that's why when we deal with a processor like the 8051, there's a technique in programming called recursion. Recursion is a function that calls itself. When you took C, did they cover recursion at all? They never mentioned recursion. I didn't think so. Not in a 7-week course on C, they wouldn't get around to recursion. But recursion is a function that calls itself. And there are many, many situations where we want to have a function that calls itself that there. And there's always an escape that there. But an example of a function that calls itself is that if I want to say find factorial, 5 factorial is equal to 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, right? Or I could say 5 factorial is equal to 5 times 4 factorial. Right there. So I could write a function called int factorial. Right there. I pass it an int. And I'm just going to call it n right there. And I can say if n not equal to 1, right there, return n times fact n minus 1. Right there. Else return 1. And a function right there. That's a function that will find the factorial of n. If I pass it 5, it's going to return 5 times factorial 4. I pass it 4, it's going to return 4 times factorial 3. I pass it 3, it's going to return 3 times factorial 2. I pass it 2, it's going to return 2 times factorial 1. I pass it 1, it returns 1. So it's going to end up returning back 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. So it's a very quick and easy function to write. And it looks like the ideal way of doing it. But the problem is every time I call factorial, I have to push onto the stack n, and I have to push onto the stack the return address. So each call, I'm going to end up using 3 places on my stack. So if I pass it factorial 30, I'm going to use up 100 memory locations on my stack real quick. That's all fine and good if you're dealing with an i5 processor on a desktop. You can pass it factorial 350 and it's not going to care because it's got 8 gig of RAM to deal with. So it's got a lot of room for the stack. Our 8051 has very little room for a stack. Right there, very little room for a stack. So we never want to use recursion with a microcontroller unless we know we're only going to go through 2 or 3 iterations. But recursion is a very common programming tool if you're dealing with some data structures such as linked lists or structures that do a linked list. And a linked list is actually a way of dynamically in other words, I have a structure here, and we're going to call this an employee right here. An employee's got a first name right there. It's got an employee number. It's got a job title, all kinds of various things on there. And one of the things it may have there, it may have a link to another employee right there. Then a link to another employee so that I can generate a sorted list very quick and easy. That's fast and easy to sort. And whenever I add a new employee, I put that new employee in the right place in the list. Where the list is always sorted. I don't have to resort the list and insert things or I can have a list that looks like this, and we link down to the next employee, and I put in a new employee. I break this link right here. I put my new employee in here, and then I link back into here. That's how I would insert a new employee, right? And I keep the list always sorted by some there. So linked lists are very popular with a lot of data structure people. And linked lists almost always use recursion when you go through and read the list or search through a name. You recursively look through it. So recursion is a very popular technique for data structures. If you're dealing with a database with a lot of records in it, a lot of information. We don't use linked lists with embedded systems very often, but If you're dealing with a payroll situation where you want to have everybody listed by employee number or student number, and have a file where if I read a particular student's record, I'm going to read, I'm going to have things in their record such as, their name, their IC number. Since we're in Malaysia, which is the same as their student number. We're going to have what program they're in. We're going to have what, what classification they are in, how many credit hours they completed, what their current GPA is, maybe a list of their current courses. All this stuff forms a record for a particular student right there. And one of the things in that record would be a link to the next student right there. So again, we tend to, a lot of programs will use recursion for that purpose right there. And the only reason I bring recursion up is because recursion creates a huge problem if we're dealing with an embedded system because of the limited size of our stack right there. Because recursion keeps calling the same function over and over again until it reaches the end, until it finds what it's looking for, or reaches the end of the list and tacks on the new person, or it reaches the terminal state like n factorial where you reach 1 right there. So you end up with this function being called over and over and over again. It's very short code. I mean, when I look at this code right here, you look at this and you see that it's basically one line. This function's one line. If n not equal 1, return n times factorial n minus 1. Else return 1. Right there. So, and you probably would have to put another one there if n equals 0, return, or negative return 0. Right there. But we assume that the person that calls it's going to return. It's going to pass a positive integer. But it looks like it's a very simple program, right? One line. And I just call this with x is equal to fact. This is fact 100 right there. I call that function, that call right there. If I did that on an 851, I just blew up my program. It just now crashes big time. And that's when we need the watchdog timer when that thing happens. Because this will send our program out to lunch because it will overwrite the stack and we have no idea where it's going. That there. Does anybody ever run a desktop program and get the blue screen down that says stack overflow? You've never seen that? But yeah, you see the blue screen, but a lot of times the blue screen will say stack overflow as part of the message that there. The blue screen of death, yeah. That there. So Windows 10 is not supposed to have it, but I've seen it with Windows 10. That there. So, but regardless, overflowing the stack is a bad thing. It's just a bad thing because when you overflow the stack, you're either overwriting real data or you're writing data to someplace that doesn't exist. That there. So stack overflows are bad. That there. So just keep that in mind that the standard, I can't remember what the standard place for the stack is, but it's like I said, you've only got a few places for the stack, a little bit of room. Assume that you've got less than 30 bytes for the stack. Okay. Going back to that, there is the stack is there. The order in which things are put onto the stack are also reversed. They're first in, last out. In other words, if I put things onto the stack, in other words, I put A, B, I push A, push B, push R0, right there. You're going to pop these off in the reverse order. Pop, R0, pop, B, pop, A, right there. So it's reverse order. First in, last out. That there. So again, I just kind of took a side note. This discussion really isn't onto the stack. Okay, getting into our interrupts. We have 22 possible sources on the F020. The 850's got a few less. Mainly it's missing interrupt 6 and 7, and interrupt 1, it's only got interrupt 0 is the only one there, external up there. So if you have interrupt one, I definitely get the pin out there. It's got 5 timer interrupts, those are the most common, and then we've got 1 serial interrupt on our processor. A serial interrupt means that it's received a byte into the serial buffer and it's ready to be read, right there. So, or a byte has been transmitted out of the serial buffer right there. Each interrupt source has an interrupt pending flag located in the special function registers. When a peripheral or external source meets a valid interrupt condition, the flag is set to 1. They're level sensitive that there, so you have to clear the flag when you get into the interrupt. Otherwise, it's going to keep calling itself. It'll be a recursive call. So the first thing you would do in any interrupt service routine is clear the interrupt right there. So all interrupts are disabled after an interrupt set, and you have to enable the interrupts. If you're going to use interrupts, you have to enable them. There are a couple interrupts that are not disableable. One is reset. Reset is an interrupt that there, and it's an active low interrupt there. So if upon power up, you can always use the reset to reset the processor that there, and its interrupt vector address is 0 right there. All interrupts are disabled that we can individually. So again, here we have our interrupt service routine or interrupt vector table is what we call this right here. This is the order in which they exist. There's 22 of them right there. The things to keep in mind is that this is our interrupt vector. So when an interrupt occurs and it's enabled, there's 2 things to keep in mind: that you've enabled all interrupts, then you've enabled the particular interrupts that you're interested in dealing with. That there is that when that interrupt occurs, the processor automatically loads into it after it pushes everything onto the stack. The exception is the reset interrupt. That doesn't push anything on the stack. That just resets right there. The reset doesn't assumes you're not going back to where you started from. It does a full, it just doesn't bother pushing anything on the stack. The interrupt is it's different, but it's treated like all other interrupts. There is that it goes to address 0000, that there, and as you recall, almost all of our programs we start with a long jump to main last semester, right? Got there. When we wrote assembly language program, the very first thing we did was we set, a CREG at 0, and then we said long jump to main. The CSEG at 0 is telling the linker to place this code in memory location 0. That is the interrupt vector right there. Is interrupt. So when there's a reset, it goes there, and the first thing it's going to see is this long jump to main. In main, we place somewhere else in memory. So we don't put in our interrupt vector table the actual code for our interrupt. All we put there is the jump to our to that there. Now, if you're working in C and we're writing C code, the compiler will automatically place in there the long jump to your code. That there, so you don't need to know that there. If you're writing in C and you call a function main, the compiler is smart enough to know that main is your main routine and will place in the interrupt vector table at address 0000 long jump to main. It does that automatically for you. That's one of the advantages of working in C is you don't have to worry about putting these jumps in there. So when we look at this here, I don't know if these slides go through with C, but we will go through that there with an example I'm going to have at the end of class here, right there. Okay. All right. So we've got all 22 of them there. We've got our timers, interrupts, our external, and these are all in the order in which they're processed that you've seen. If 2 interrupts occur at the same time, the one in the higher order is the one that's processed right there. So that there, and we've got, our end of conversions also an interrupt right there, external interrupts or UARTs. Our external crystal is ready, also generates an interrupt if we want to use that there. We could, instead of, back when we talked about using the external clock, we did a little poll waiting for waiting for that to come back. We could go off and do other things and have that interrupt us and go back and start switch over to the external crystal right there. So again, typically, things happen with a processor in the microsecond range. The probability of 2 interrupts occurring at the same time is fairly rare. Now, if we're servicing an interrupt and a higher order interrupt comes along, it will stop and go and service the higher interrupt there. Typically, you want to spend as little time as possible in your interrupt service routine. You want to get in there, service routine, and get out. That there. So, that there. I'm not going to go through a lot of these right here, but each of the interrupt services can be individually enabled or disabled. We have 3 special function registers there, IE, EIE1, EIE2. That's interrupt enable, extended interrupt enable, and extended interrupt enable 2. Those are there. The original 8051 only had 4 or 5 interrupt sources, but now we have, like I said, 22 in this particular case. So we have the extended interrupt service routine right there. So in addition to the individual bits, there's a global right there. That's actually bit 7 of the IE table, but you just call it EA equals 1 or set bit 1 if you're doing, or set bit EA if you're in assembly language. And this will turn on or off all enabled interrupts. If you want to enable a particular interrupt, you have to do both. You have to enable the global interrupt, and then you have to enable the individual interrupts right there. So if I just set EA high right there, all that's going to do is tell it that if there's an interrupt that's enabled to service it. But I also have to enable any interrupts I want to service right there. So the default is everything is shut off when you power up. That's the default right there. So we have to set 2 bits right there. And this, I didn't read the slide. You see that it's going to say the same thing I just got done saying, but you have to set 2 bits. Some require more than that. If you wanted to do, say, a timer interrupt, you have to start the timer, and that there. We'll talk about the timers in a little bit more detail. That there. The interrupt cannot be turned off. That there. So we have our priorities. We talked enough about that. 2 priority levels. That there. So again, timer overflow interrupt. We talk about the fact that forward reverse, this can wait a few extra milliseconds, not to be unnoticed. The keypad interrupt is set to low priority. So there are things that you can say that it's very important that my pulse width modulation is set, continues to run, the motor continues to be processed accordingly. That there, if somebody pushes a button on a keypad, a couple of milliseconds is not going to affect that person's the response time. And remember, we're talking response times in the milliseconds. We're not talking seconds, and we're not talking minutes or hours. We're talking, thousandths of a second. That there. So if you're dealing with human interaction, a person, a 20 millisecond delay is not enough for the person to notice. That there. Okay, first interrupt the service forward first. There. Have the same priority. The fixed priority determines that this just gets in the priority. It's very, very rare that 2 interrupts are recognized simultaneously. That's you're talking a super race condition for that to happen. It does happen on occasion, but some interrupts are automatically cleared. With there, most are not cleared. So as I was just mentioning right here, this is the key thing right here. Whenever we go into an interrupt service routine, the first thing we always have to do, is clear that interrupt. We have to tell the processor, I'm taking care of this. Don't keep reminding me that there. Don't. Otherwise, it's going to just keep calling back. That there. So If an interrupt remains after the processor completes, a new interrupt request will be generated and will enter the routine. So if we don't clear it, it's going to keep it coming back. It's going to keep coming back and trying to do it. So we have to clear it. That there. If an interrupt is disabled, we're going to ignore it anyway. We don't care about the flag. That there. You know, the nurse has got a patient in room 12 that's being a pain in the neck. They keep asking for, you know, there's a term that nurses call in the U.S. They call them drug seekers. You probably don't have them in Malaysia too much because they don't use opiates for pain medicine here. But opiates are a type of pain medicine that's very addictive, and they induce pleasure if you take more than you're supposed to. People will abuse them, and patients will keep hitting the nurse button saying, "Give me another shot of morphine. Give me more morphine. Give me more morphine." So they'll turn off that light or they'll actually go over and they'll unscrew the bulb because they don't want to, they don't want to deal with that patient. They can, the doctor says that they can have 2 milligrams per hour. Once they've had their 2 milligrams per hour, you're not going to go in there and keep telling the patient, no more pain meds, no more pain meds. Oh, can you call the doctor and see if I get some more? And patients will do that. So after I had my knee surgery, they put me on a little thing where I could push a button to get pain medicine. And when I reach my hourly quota, I could hold my thumb on the button. I'm not going to get any more out of there. I got my 5 milligrams per hour or whatever it was. So they control that fairly tightly. So, but regardless, if an interrupt is disabled, the flag is just simply ignored right there. We just simply, if we don't enable, for example, the serial interface, we send data to the serial buffer. We're not going to process it. It's just going to get ignored. So talking to the serial buffer is a waste of time. So I'm not going to go into these right here. This is our timer control right there. We've got when we look at our timers, there's multiple ones but as we look at our timer, we've had the interrupt overflow flag. This is our timer is running. This is our T0 interrupt flag. It says it's running. This is our external interrupt. That's the flag is set when there's an interrupt there, whether it's edge triggered or level triggered. 0, external interrupt, and interrupt 0 type edge trigger. So this is basically our timer, but it also gets into the 2 external interrupts as well. But these are all part of our special function registers that we have to deal with. And these are bit addressable. TF1, it simply says that timer 1 is overflowed. TR1 means that it's running or it's not running, and we can either enable it or disable it right there. Timer 0, flag and run control, right there. And I'm not going to get into these right there. This IE7 is the interrupt 7 pending flag. IE6 external interrupt. They're external. I'm not going to get into those. This is our external. This is our enable all interrupts. I mentioned that. That's not really part of the interrupts. And this enables our various interrupts right there. And as you go through it, you can see we've got all of our various interrupts that we would set the bits if we want them to be enabled, or set them to 0 if we want them to be disabled. Right there. We can play with our priorities. I generally have never had to do that. Right there. And that's really it. There. Now, I've got a little bit more time. Is that right? No, this is off an hour. Where does this think I am? Somehow it got me into a different place. Okay. It still doesn't see me Oh, well, that's time in San Diego. We don't care about the time in San Diego. Set time automatically. And please wait. Okay, well, regardless, we don't want that there. Let me go back to, actually what I want to do now is kind of show that this is kind of screwed up. We're not ready for it yet, but let me just give a little demo here of a particular program that uses the timer right here. And you'll get a chance to run this program later, but I want to this particular code right here actually sets up right here. If we look at this right here, this actually sets up timer 2 right here. In timer 2, this sets up our clock. Let's find that there. This enables our crossbar and right there. But timer 2 is we stop that there, clear that, and we also have to do here, we also have our ADC initialized. ADC is disabled. Conversions require triggers on timer 2 overflow. We set that up. We set our clock, and then we set up our enable conversion complete interrupt right here, and enable right there. So this here, and somewhere in here we have to enable. Oh, this actually enables the UAR right there. Right here, but clear the. Okay, this is the interrupt for the ADC. Notice that this is what I wanted to show here. Notice here that it says interrupt right there. ADC ISR comma interrupt ADC 0 comma or not comma underscore end of conversion. This tells the compiler that this is an interrupt service routine that there, or the analog to digital converter, and it's for ADC 0 end of conversion. This is telling the compiler that this particular function right here is our service routine for our. This program also had one for the serial. I removed that, but whenever ADC 0 hits the end of conversion, it's going to go into this routine and perform this code. Now, as this code does right here, it's a very simple code. It says accumulator is plus or equal ADC 0, so it's keeping track of how many that there. This particular code is if measurements is equal to 0, 0. Equal to 0, then we're done taking measurements. This particular code takes 2,048 measurements and then divides that to get the result right there. So it will go out and grab one measurement, then it'll decrement from the number of measurements. Once it's done the number of measurements, it resets it back to 10, 20, or 2048 for the next round right there. So, and then it basically calculates what the result is right there. So, and that's end of file right there. So, but the key thing is this is set up whenever the timer overflows, it's going to go and grab a measurement from the analog to digital converter right there. So, that there. So there's another function in here for setting up the timer. This initializes the ADC. We'll come back and look at that function when I cover the analog digital converter right there. Right there. This particular function right here sets up our timer 2. It stops it, select the system clock for timer 2 soars, sets the reload value for 10 microseconds, sets it to reload immediately, and starts it. So this thing will just, every 10 microseconds, it's going to overflow, which is then going to generate a analog to digital conversion on ADC 0. So you guys kind of see the flow of events here. We set up our timer to overflow every 10 microseconds, but our timer doesn't trigger an interrupt. We're not using a timer interrupt. We're using the timer to trigger our analog digital converter to, right there, timer ADC 0 is disabled and conversion is triggered on timer 2 interrupts right there. Now, again, I'm not going pulling up the data sheet to show how that's set up right there, but that's how that's set up. We set our analog clock to 12.25 megahertz. We set up our clock in terms of telling it how we want it, the A to D to work. And we haven't covered that. We're telling it it's going to be in 10-bit mode, and 12-bit mode disabled, low power mode disabled, positive input, ADC that there, and on like that. So we're setting that up. We'll come back to that. All I'm really wanting to get across in this demonstration is that we set up our clock, is that we're just, our code does absolutely nothing right there. Anybody see the main part of our code? What's it say? Our loop that runs forever. While 1, right? It doesn't do anything, right? This code does absolutely nothing when you first look at it. Right there. It just says while 1, do nothing. Right there. And also notice just before that, we enable all of our interrupts. We do an EA right there. So we have a couple functions that we call system clock init. The port init, we're not using any of the ports, so we really don't need that one. Our timer 2 init and our ADC 0 init. So right there. So if I run our code right there, it doesn't do anything, but I'm going to place in here, right here under millivolt, I'm going to add that to a watch value right there. And I'm also going to put a breakpoint here, right there. And what I want to show is that every time I run this, it's going to stop here, right there. Now millivolt came back at 0 at that point. Right there it came back at 3300. There's a potentiometer on our board right here that's turned to the max. So I'm actually reading the center tap of this potentiometer. So if I move it to the middle and I run this twice, right there, I got 1.5, that's 1.55 volts. That's pretty close to the middle. I just randomly picked the middle. If I go all the way to the other end, I got 0. I got to hit it twice. Right there. I move it to the middle, to the other end, I get 3300 right there. So I'm actually reading the potentiometer on this right here. But this is getting called every time. Now, I'm going to put a breakpoint here and also put a watch value on result. Right. See, now result, it comes back with 0 every other time because it gets cleared right there. So it's basically looking at there. I can also put a watch point on that there. And this tells me how many measurements that we've got here. Oh, I don't have I have a breakpoint here. Why is it? measurements should be going back to, oh, because it's inside there. That's why it's not, I want to take that breakpoint out there. I want to put measurements, put my breakpoint here. And you can see each time I run through there, it stops at the interrupt, and that's going down right there. Right here. And I can also view debug window, special function registers, and I can look at ADC0, and I can see what the value of ADC0 is right there. See, it's right there, it's 022A right there. So, but this whole discussion right here, all I just wanted to show really here is how we set up our interrupt service routine right there. This line here is the most important thing right there. This is telling our software that this function we've got here is an interrupt function. And which interrupt is it? It's the ADC's interrupt ADC0 end of conversion interrupt is what this is. So that this knows to place into the code memory the address for that, and right there, ADC0 window comparator. Right here. So in memory location 7B is where I would place this code. You know, actually 7B will be a long jump to this function right there is what it would be. So in other words, this tells the linker that in location 007B there's a long jump to this function right here. Right there. But this interrupt ADC0 / underscore interrupt underscore ADC0 underscore end of conversion is a key word to tell it it's this one right here. That's what tells the compiler that we're servicing that interrupt right there. So, and each time I run this code right here, where each time I run this code, it stops in this function right there. It stops in that function right there. And it only gets to this function whenever there's an end of conversion interrupt from the analog to digital converter. The analog to digital converter is actually triggered by our timer. Our timer triggers are up there. So we don't have an interrupt for our timer because our timer starts the analog to digital conversion up there. And what we have not talked about is setting up this here. The hard part is knowing how to set up these special function registers to tell that to do that. But that's where the conversion or the configuration wizard helps. And I don't want to go into that right there because we'll talk about as we go through the slides. I got one lecture on just analog digital conversion, and you'll do this lab here. I just brought this particular file up because it was a good example of showing the interrupt right there, interrupt ADC0, how that is set up right there. And notice that the very first thing we do there, by the way, just to point something else out, is the very first line in our code is AD init interrupt analog digital is conversion complete. That we clear that flag before we do anything else. That's the very first thing we do is we clear that flag right there. And again, this code simply goes through. It takes 2,048 measurements, averages about. It tells that That's, you know, and it does 2048 just simply in order to reduce the noise. All right, I'm going to quit at this point. I've got 9:38. My time is still wrong. And I talked an hour. That's good.